Thanks so much for joining me. This is Laith Marouf from Free Palestine TV. Thank you. So yeah, just looking at the events in Syria and the sudden collapse, this was obviously months, if not years, in the making. We had the murder of Haj Qasem Soleimani, who was the regional architect of the resistance in 2020. The freeze on the conflict in Syria in 2020, the ceasefire that now looking at it in hindsight allowed the terrorist groups to regroup and to strengthen as Syria was put under crushing sanctions in 2019, which pretty much gutted its economy and its army. Also in the last year, there were some reports in Arab media, and when I say Arab media, I mean resistance media, that ISIS leaders were intentionally let out of prison by the hundreds in the northeast of Syria, and you saw them move downward and attack on the ground Syrian army police sites and military sites as Israel was bombing them from the air. So this was obviously a very coordinated campaign. We saw like right in front of us over the past year, if anyone was following the parallel coordination between the ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra offshoots attacks on the ground and the Zionist entities attacks in the air. So just if there's anything else to add to that, kind of give us a little bit more of just the context of how we got to this point structurally. And I know there's like a lot of people that are also curious as to why the Syrian army didn't take up a lot of the initiative to rehabilitate its army as they were recommended to do so in 2018. And also, if there was anything, despite like 80–90% of its oil fields and its agricultural land in the northeast were occupied both by the Kurdish Contras and U.S. bases that were stationed in that strategic and resource-rich area, which helped them basically steal billions in oil nonstop since their occupation in that region. So basically, is there anything Syria could have done to rehabilitate its military or or basically take back those resources? Do you think also is it some kind of a failure from Syria's allies, both economically and militarily, that they didn't give it some kind of economic or institutional boost or assistance? These are a lot of the questions that I had in the last 2 weeks. So if there's any kind of clarification, go ahead.
Yeah, well, obviously in 2016, the Russians stopped the Syrian military and its allies Hezbollah from taking back Idlib. And similarly, there was a deal between the Americans and the Russians to jointly control the northeast of Syria, meaning not to allow the Syrian military to fight the Kurdish Contras or try to expel the American occupation from the oil and gas fields and the wheat and other grain fields. So Syria was at once impoverished, actually even worse with the suspension of hostilities or the temporary whatever ceasefires that the Russians brokered, but also the Russians and the Iranians, at least the Russians did this on purpose. They didn't fill any of the gap in the economic downfall of Syria. They didn't replace the wheat or gas or oil that they could have as one of the largest exporters in the world. And similarly, Iran failed to conduct its own policies because it, on the one hand, did not want to confront Russia, who had control of the seaports of Syria. And so the situation for Syrians after the ceasefire became worse, actually. And it's very important for us when we think about revolutionary decolonization movements, that the worst thing that could happen to revolutionary decolonization movements is stagnation.
Yeah.
Because you know, maybe those who live the process of fighting the colonial or imperialist project can understand as punishment comes for succeeding. But those who are born after and or didn't live the situation before, it's if the revolutionary state, the decolonizing state, doesn't give them more gains and or show them a struggle against colonization and imperialism, they are lost to the propaganda and the reality of the living conditions. And that's what happened. You know, you have soldiers that for 10 years didn't fight and were being recruited at $20 a month salaries, and there was no improvement in the electricity, gas, and or food situation in the country. So you had a whole generation growing up even more impoverished, and they don't know what was there before. So the country was ready to be flipped over, as happened, and the Russians did a deal with the Turks and the Israelis to carve up Syria, and you know, in return for Russia getting the territories that it occupies in Ukraine.
Yeah, and there's also the point to be made about how the Zionist entity was striking, killing Hezbollah and the IRGC in Syria. And Syria was prevented from fighting back against this. Syria, the air defenses, the S-300s, I believe, that Russia supplied Syria, which have to be operated by them, were never activated or allowed to be activated. So that, of course, provided a lot of the softening up of the ground for the terrorists to take over a lot of the sites that were systematically airstruck in Syria, and further pushed out the Iranians, because President Assad was sidelining them, the Iranians, and of course they asked him twice if they could come in the end, I believe, stationed in the south, and he declined multiple offers. So the Iranians were never really binding in their request, and they never really pushed on this. But of course, I think the most striking aspect of the Russian strategy and recommendation in Syria was the fatal mistake of letting them Syria letting them not let them strike Israel for its many attacks.
Look, I would. It's easy to blame everything on President Assad and or Syria, but the truth of the matter, there was no sovereign Syria since the various international players entered the country. So what Iran, unfortunately, this is where the problem lies, I think, for the axis of resistance as a whole, is the insistence of the axis to uphold international law, uphold the word democracy, and which doesn't exist. The enemy is occupying directly. Syria is occupying directly, Iraq is occupying directly, Yemen is changing demographics openly. Even in Yemen, for instance, you know, the provinces like Socotra now have United Arab Emirates calling code and or driver's licenses and driver plates. So for Iran to say that, well, we asked President Assad and he refused it, I think that is a cop-out. Iran already knows how to operate in states that don't have sovereignty, as in Lebanon, where the Lebanese army is infiltrated and captured by the West. And therefore, it builds an Hezbollah and help Hezbollah perform the actions of sovereignty on this territory. Similarly,
Exactly,
they could have done that
exactly.
in Syria. They could have actually armed different factions in Syria. They could have also entered the oil and gas and wheat and food to Syria with or without the Syrian government's approval if they wanted to. So this is where the problem lies. It's easy to blame everything on President Assad and or corruption in a state that doesn't exist. But that's not what a revolutionary would be doing. They would actually think of the solutions instead of finding excuses for not doing the work.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was clear, and this is what Iranians from the inside have told me, that, you know, the offers and Iran's actions and, you know, so-called recommendations to Syria, especially in the last year, were obviously not binding. They obviously weren't even really putting effort in it at that point. And it was clear from their statements after, you know, Syria's collapse, that they kind of just, you know, threw up their hands and didn't really put much of an effort into you know, pushing for that, specifically because there was some sort of internal dynamic that they didn't want to get tangled up in. As you say, it was a war with Russia or conflicting with Russia on the inside that they didn't want to do. So how do you think this is going to affect like the future of Russian Iranian cooperation, and why would Russia at the same time be okay with allowing ally in the Middle East to basically collapse? Because doesn't this also pose like a security issue for them to kind of have this breeding ground for terrorism? That was the whole reason Haj Qasem Soleimani convinced the Russians to kind of come in the first place in back in 2015, was that this could cause some blowback, and obviously I think that we're going to see that. We're also going to see it in China with the Uyghurs. So where's the foresight in that, really?
Well, I think, you know, Russia is playing a dangerous game, and the game that they have in their mind is that they would actually like the West to concentrate their military and economic power on the Arab and Muslim peoples in West Asia. Because up until now, when we look historically over the last 30 years, the more embroiled the West is in wars in the Arabic and Muslim countries, the faster Russia and China can develop and be left alone. So ultimately, what the Russians did just now is they are making it more palatable for Trump, for instance, coming into power, to now concentrate on fighting the war with Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and of course Iran. That will probably drag the US for the next 10 years. And in the meanwhile, Russia thinks that it can secure itself to a point where the US cannot attack it ever. Now, this is short-sighted for both the Russians and the Chinese. And this is because obviously right now, the only reason the Russian economy continues to be healthy is because it's selling all its products, raw materials, to China, who is selling all their products to the rest of the world. But as soon as the Road and Belt project falls apart, which is already falling apart, with the fall of Syria into the hands of the West, that means everything between Turkey and the Emirates is all controlled by the West, and that means there's, for China to do a new Silk Road, it has to go through American territories, American captured territories, which is not going to happen. Similarly, if Yemen falls, the only sea route that China was safe in, that wasn't under control of the West, would be also closed off. And once China's export routes are under imperialist control, that means that even if the West lets China trade through those routes, it will be making money out of that. You see, and if they close it, then the Chinese economy collapses, and with that, the Russian economy collapses because there will be no more export of their raw products. And so, I think the same mistake that the Soviets did with their animosity to Arab unification projects like Jamal Abdel Nasser's, because of their fear of a rise of another pole that is outside of their influence. Russia fell, and China right now fell into the same trap. Their fear of a rise of a unified front, economic and military, in Western Asia made them allow this to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, this is they could have had a big opportunity there, because I remember when Yemen was the Yemeni resistance was saying that, we're not going to detain Russian and Chinese ships, as they were basically attacking the Israel-linked ships that were going through the Red Sea. And it was obvious that the Yemeni resistance had taken down the U.S. Navy. They were still extending their arms to the Russians and the Chinese economically in that sense. But it's just kind of disappointing that with the sacrifices this region went through, looking specifically at Yemen and Syria, which would have been the so-called Silk Road or BRICS linchpins in the West Asia Arab world. There was no economic subsidization of any kind of sorts. Of course, I don't really know too much about the mechanics of how this would work, but I remember, Assad visiting China just this year or last year, and they was taking steps to join BRICS. And as we're seeing, we're not hearing anything about BRICS anymore since the collapse of Syria, because there wasn't really any kind of prioritization or ideological vision given in this process of BRICS that could have strategized how to really build a multipolar world based on principles and make it binding. It was just the same kind of focused on the high returns, high capital, states around the world. And a lot of these states were still allies of the US and using that position to kind of sabotage other countries from joining, like Algeria, or like Brazil with Venezuela. So, I mean, BRICS kind of did this to themselves without having that kind of truly inclusive vision of a post-hegemonic economic order that's truly cooperative, despite that kind of being the tagline. So I don't know how much responsibility can be played on China or on the big BRICS powers for kind of letting Syria economically rot and not at least kind of giving it a leg up. But yeah, like I think China and Yemen definitely, I mean, Syria and Yemen should have just had definitely a lot more economic support, given the sacrifices and the future importance they would have had, physically and economically, towards integrating the Silk Road in this supposed vision, or integrating the West Asia region in this supposed vision.
Yeah, look, we can, as Arabs, as Muslims, as West Asians, we can spend forever right now also blaming China and Russia. But, these are lessons that were already taught to us multiple generations before. And the only reason actually Iran has gained such a stature on a global scale is because it was able to deliver on what the non-aligned movement or the third world movement couldn't. It became independent scientifically, technologically, economically, and that's the way to go. The problem that I think Iran fell into is that it forgot that for a moment. when the courting by Russia and China started, it started believing that there is a possibility of a new multipolar world with just allying with superpowers. No, multipolarity will only rise from sovereigns that are fully independent and are on equal footing. You see, so currently Iran has to go back to the strategies that it had prior to the rise of BRICS and the reemergence of Russia on the international scene. It has to depend only on itself. And it also has to prioritize that vision again. And part of
Khomeini's neither a West nor East.
yes, and this is not because it you know, we should never be friends with anybody else or Russians or Chinese or whatever. No, but because in international relations, real politics is the only thing that you can depend on. Everybody has, you know, culture and religion and history, and they claim to, but all of that disappears once you are doing international relations and or at war. Everybody thinks of their own best interest, and only when Iran is able to stand fully 100% and become a pole by itself without anybody's help will the you know, the attention of Russia and China change. Currently, you know, we saw how BRICS courted the Saudis and the Turks and did not want to court Iran and Syria, right?
Yeah.
And that should have been already
Also, Iran, Iran was denied from the SCO for years. It's ridiculous.
Yes, yes. So you have, it's clear that both Russia and China also fear of the Turkic effect, you know, of Turkey itself influence on Central Asia. And instead of working with Syria and Iran to counter that reality with, let's say, opening schools, influencing media, all of these things, what they did is they did the opposite of that. And they will regret it, of course, when the time comes for the US to relaunch the Mongol horde from Turkey.
Right. And there's already been blowback and signs of this backfiring, I think, because I mean, it's not even signs that just show up now. It's just the obvious trajectory. One with Turkey's almost like funding of a not an axis of resistance, but an axis of evil that extends all the way to Central Asia, that cuts into China itself with the Uyghurs that they've trained and also let loose in Syria now. There's also Chechens in Syria that might blow back on Russia as well. It's I don't know. I just don't like. This is why actually I denied the explanation in the very beginning, 2 weeks ago, that somehow there was a deal that the U.S. Took Ukraine or allowed Russia to kind of have its concessions favorable on Ukraine, while Syria would just be allowed to collapse. I still, we're still waiting for an official confirmation on it or any kind of definite signs on if this was the deal. But situationally, there was just so many signs. I've heard also on Lebanese programs, people that were close to Assad speculate this. I've heard, I'm hearing more and more analysts speculate this now. And I remember seeing the signs like Lavrov talking about some sort of moderate opposition in his interview just days before their final meeting. And I don't know. I just want to know if you have any more definite certainty on if this specifically was the deal that was agreed upon, or if there's been any confirmation of that.
Well, we just heard yesterday President Putin say that the HTS is not a terrorist organization.
That language too, yeah.
Because the West is not calling them terrorists anymore, and that they changed. So, it's clear that Russia is, approves of this new government. I would say that, President Assad, former President Assad, was kidnapped. It's not that he just resigned. He was called in with his family to a dinner in Russia and never allowed to go back. This was 4 days before the attack on Aleppo. He was never in Syria from that point on. Similarly, the systems, the communication systems of the Syrian military, which are all Russian, either were jammed in the front lines and or orders to retreat and surrender were given on them. That's not something, a breach that the West can do easily if the Russians were not involved in that. And I would say, finally, the stockpiles of the Syrian military, either the Russians gave the coordinates to the Israelis, and or these Wahhabi death squads that were roaming the ground after the collapse of the Syrian state were giving coordinates. In any case, these are all weapons from Russia that the Syrian government paid for, some of them still unpaid for, that the Russians allowed to be destroyed as they just sat down and watched. So it's not, all of these wouldn't happen if Russia didn't make a deal. And some people ask me, well, do the Russians really trust America? I don't think it's the issue of them trusting America, not reneging on a deal for Ukraine. It's just that they see...
They're just prioritizing their region.
Yes, and they see actually that the West will be stuck for the next 10 years at least in a war with the axis of resistance.
Yeah.
And they want them to be stuck there better than being on their front line.
Right. Because the West game in the West Asia region was always getting its adversaries kind of wrapped around in endless conflict, especially after the resistance tried to flip the script on that strategy and embroil the Zionist entity in the U.S. in a war of attrition, or attempting to. So I really think that this was a kind of an attempt for the U.S. to try to bring Iran into having to do that in Syria. And maybe they intended for Russia to do so too, but Russia kind of flipped the script on that, and possibly, if what you're saying is true, and we'll find out more and more in the future, it's they pulled that on the US eventually. But why would the Russians even need to fight in the beginning? Why couldn't have they just done the deal before November 27th? Why did they still strike terrorists in Aleppo? Because it seemed like there was fighting going on, and then right before everyone got to Homs, that's when everything just suddenly stopped.
Yeah, I mean, it would have looked, right now, the way they played it is so confusing that nobody can, convince everybody of one story. If they would have withdrawn from day one, it would have been very clear that the Russians have made a deal. If they didn't look like they're trying to negotiate with Iran for 2 days before they allowed the collapse, again, it would have been very clear, the betrayal. So the Russians played a good propaganda, I think, in terms of how confusing it is for all the other parties. And the thing is that it's clear that for more than a decade, the Russians were prioritizing Turkey and Israel's need in Syria over the needs of the Syrian government, the Syrian military, and/or the axis of resistance in Iran. It was clear for anyone who is not a child that the Russians were not allowing Syria to fire back at Israel. The Russians were not allowing Syria to clear Idlib. The Russians were not allowing Syria to clear Deir ez-Zor and the northeast. And so, you know, the problem, I think, for why Syria fell was not even because Russia was you know, collaborating with Turkey and Israel. That should have been expected. And so where I would put the blame is on us.
Yeah.
You cannot, you know, pretend that you cannot go to war against Israel and the whole Western Empire and then not play the most vicious game possible. If you want to play within certain limitations and red lines, well, your enemy doesn't have limitations and red lines.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The delays, the lack of deterrence showed. And I think that opened up an opportunity for it to really be a free-for-all in Syria. Because you know, I understood in the beginning the long game and you know, the aspect of restraint, but after, you know, a few months, when it became really obvious that the true promise responses were intentionally delayed in favor of false concessions or false hopes of concessions, or just in general, just the hesitancy, which obviously it showed it's how bad the consequences of this hesitancy were when we saw the elimination of leadership in Lebanon. We saw the constant crossing of red lines across the axis. How does the axis expect to recoup from that? Basically, what kind of challenges is Syria going to pose, and hopefully, what kind of implications are? Hopefully, there's going to be some kind of a plan B that both Iran and Hezbollah have. I would have expected, at least since 2015, they would have tried to have something, you know, in their back pocket for a scenario like this. Is there any kind of plan in place or recourse for, you know, specifically, especially Hezbollah and Iran?
Well, I think those who can get weapons into Gaza right now,
Yeah, and Yemen,
as we're speaking, they can get weapons into Lebanon, with or without
yeah,
Syria. So I don't have a, you know, worry about weapons getting to Lebanon.
yeah.
And there
I
is
mean, otherwise those
definitely,
routes were being exposed and targeted anyway. So of course they would have already had some kind of an alternative.
yeah, and I mean,
Hmm.
obviously Hezbollah has much bigger manufacturing capabilities now than it had 10 years ago.
Yeah,
And finally, I think the only thing that they may probably will want to smuggle in pieces are the big ballistic missiles and so on. That's going to be a little bit harder than it was before. I think if the axis of resistance still has a chance,
I believe it could be done. Yeah,
yeah, they still have a chance to change the playing field, the axis of resistance, but they need to go on the offensive.
yeah,
For instance, right now,
absolutely.
Yemen should be prepared to go on the offensive and not wait to get attacked by US and Israel as it's currently receiving these attacks. For
Yeah,
instance, Yemen should try to destroy Israeli airfields and air bases and their air capabilities. And Iran, which still has promise, truthful promise 3, should probably target those. If we destroy Israeli air capabilities, it changes the whole playing field. And
Yeah.
it doesn't matter that we lost Syria. Hezbollah could move on the ground easier. Resistance inside Syria could suddenly be flourishing. But as long as the air capabilities of the Israelis and the Americans in the region are left intact, then we are just setting ourselves up for more assassinations, more destruction of our countries, and just positioning ourselves in a defensive posture. I would say one last thing here is that the lesson from what we saw over the last 15 months is that anti-colonial struggles, decolonization struggles today are not the same as in the 1960s and 70s. Not only because, let's say, the Vietnamese and the Algerians didn't have to face the whole might of the West at the same time, but also because today the United States can print money as it wishes. Okay. Wars of attrition between decolonization people and a colonial power in the 60s and 70s didn't have to deal with unlimited funds. Okay, like the United States can just print whatever money it wants to. It can never go bankrupt. Okay, it doesn't matter how much it costs it to produce its weapons. It will loot all of its allies to continue a war, and it will go to the end. Nixon didn't have that power before he made the dollar as when he was still fighting the war on Vietnam. That happened after the end of the war on Vietnam. Similarly, the French couldn't just print money to fight the Algerian war. They had to collapse at some point. The Americans today, wars of attritions of the United States cannot be won the same way that Algeria and Vietnam won. They have to actually target assets and sources of income that back the dollar. So as long as the oil fields of the Gulf monarchs are pumping, which is the major backer of the American dollar, the Americans can print more and more and continue genocide and war. So it will be ideal for the axis of resistance to take those two major things that keep the empire going. One is air bases around the region. Second is the oil fields.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what Yemen was targeting back when it had that direct confrontation with the UAE and Saudi Arabia in 2019 and 2020. I really hope to see them kind of go more on the offensive with those again, even though they've pretty much stayed out of the direct confrontation for that reason. Also, are we going to see any hope for Iran coming more on the offensive, especially as Israel and the U.S. are directly at this point saying, okay, now Syria is collapsed. There's more open airspace to directly target Iran. And while the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has been giving he's given the orders for Iran to go on the offensive, for the True Promise 1, 2, and 3 to take place. But now you have a political bureau in Iran that's almost kind of self-sabotaging with their relative weakness and relative inclination to just wanted to negotiate their way out of things. And people are saying that Zarif behind the scenes is always leading this push. So while others say that no, like everything is ultimately in the Supreme Leader's hands, and he wouldn't let things get too out of hand or out of control. So do we have kind of hope for Iran to eventually stand firm and go on the offensive and kind of reel themselves out of the trajectory that was the first year of this, especially in the last few months?
Well, I hope so. I mean, and we can't really read into the future so far, but look, when the Iranian elections were happening after the martyrdom of President Raisi, a lot of people that are diehard Axis of Resistance supporters were not happy about the election of the new president and saw him as liberal and weak.
Absolutely.
My first reaction was that, I don't believe in democracy. And I don't think there is democracy in Iran, as there is no democracy anywhere on this planet. So I thought in my head that, maybe it was a good play, like getting Obama elected in the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Here was a man who is from the Azeri
because you
background.
had someone appealing to the liberals, you had someone appealing to the separatists with his Azeri Kurdish identity. You had someone, yeah.
Yes, so I thought it was like, maybe it's a good play. But right now, I'm starting to think maybe the Iranians actually believed in the lie of democracy or something. And that would be really weird in my mind if they actually believed in democracy and that they allowed this to happen without any channels of control. So I hope that this is still theatrics, but then I'm not Iranian and I'm not very educated on the internal mechanisms of the Iranian state.
Yeah, exactly. And I think understanding the internal mechanisms would help understand this, help put this in more into context, because I do know that, we do know, we've seen this lesson before with Rouhani. We have seen since in the last administration how Iran was almost defanged through the JCPOA, which almost sacrificed not only Iran's defense capabilities, but its economy too. It was tied into making Iran more import dependent, as well as stripping it of its nuclear capabilities in exchange for like a couple crumbs of sanctions relief, which they could just build themselves out of anyway. But yeah, I think that we wouldn't need to really learn this lesson again after what we've seen in the 8 years before Raisi came. So I kind of just hope that I do know that there's definitely elements in the Iranian political and bureaucratic government that just are incredibly naive. But I kind of hope the more resistance oriented elements and those that follow the supreme leader can kind of push back against that. So let's hope. So just looking back to kind of the implications that this has onto Lebanon. Now that the Zionist entity not only has the like it had the South with Lebanon, right? And this was kind of like a big barrier due to Hezbollah's presence in the South. Now they're invading the 1701 border, because no one really expected UNIFIL and the Lebanese army to really do anything. So there's been nonstop violations there in the South. Also on the eastern border between Syria and Lebanon, the Zionists have extended and positioned there as well. So after the ceasefire terms up, do you see Lebanon going back into war?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to last even to the end of those 60 days, because
I don't think Hezbollah even expected them to really adhere to a ceasefire. I think that it should have been fully expected that the Zionist entity would just take this opportunity to really start something elsewhere and reposition their line of offense to attack again. So I think that this was expected. Yeah,
I mean, there was a statement from Hezbollah yesterday, I believe, saying that they're not going to do anything. They're going to leave the Lebanese military do its work and the Lebanese state. So it's a little bit, I don't know where they're going with this Hezbollah. but maybe at least they're trying to make sure this ceasefire stays into effect until the coming of Trump. Maybe they don't want to be attacked right now. They don't want to give an excuse for the Israelis and the Wahhabi death squads to attack Lebanon.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're probably worried about that. So the effects of the loss of Syria are going to be huge on Lebanon, even if Hezbollah continues to be able to be armed and so forth. Right now, there's every treacherous person that was holding themselves back in Lebanon is ready to go on the offensive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you see, like, what's happening in Lebanon is a little bit worrying because I think Hezbollah also still is staying true to those ideals of sharing power and the multipolarity of Lebanon itself, while the enemy is not.
Mhm.
So I think of the same thing about, you remember how everybody was saying, oh, Iran is occupying Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. But in reality, we see the enemy is the one that's occupying openly and doesn't care
Yeah.
what anybody thinks about it. So as long
Yeah.
as the axis of resistance members and leadership put a lot of weight into public opinion, they will continue making mistakes in such ways.
Exactly,
Because
because the enemy doesn't have that same impunity of public opinion. They've already propagandized half of Lebanon. They have hegemony that extends both materially and ideologically. So I
yes,
just
yes, but
think
also
that
the enemy also knows that they should not give a damn about public opinion. You see, the public opinion in the West is anti-genocide, is for the Palestinian liberation, is anti all of these wars, and the elite in the West just step all over their public, because their public will not do anything beyond just go out in the street a little bit and demonstrate here and
they're
there.
not even doing that
Anything.
anymore.
Similarly, how Netanyahu doesn't give a damn about the families of the captives that are in Gaza. He doesn't care about the demonstrations in the streets. He can do whatever he wants to, right? So the problem is that propaganda wars and are important when actually there is a hope in a population to change, to take action. Look at even Syria. Let me just be very clear. Syria, yes, the West put a lot of propaganda to destabilize the country, but that's not the reason that they won this war in Syria. The reason is that they had militias with guns taking control, and the Russian military sold Syria out. So the opinion of the Syrian public doesn't matter really in the outcome of the war. Similarly, right now in Lebanon, who gives a damn about the opinion of the Lebanese people? Let me be very frank here.
Yeah.
So what's going to make a difference is who's going to carry arms, make a state.
Absolutely.
And as long as Hezbollah wants to allow individuals that don't have real power to take so much space in the government,
Yeah.
it will find itself on the losing side.
Right, especially because like look at the Free Patriotic Movement, how it's Gibran Bassil narcissistically, as expected, just turned his back on the resistance because he didn't get his promise to be president, even though this there, as you described, there's no real power there. So I just think Hezbollah, unfortunately, bikabberon, when they don't show that might is right, and in a country like Lebanon where it's a jungle basically, it's all the more important to really do that at some point, to really show the initiative and taking control, especially as there's not just the threat, but the reality of destabilization that is as regional as it is national. And this is the next card that's going to be played against Lebanon, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So my next question is just kind of speaking more like you made me think of it right now when you talked about all people in the US can do really is just kind of go on the streets a little bit. Like again, we see that when they're not even really doing that. So why and I almost like noticed that there was like it's almost like curated in the extent that there were such large but mostly symbolic demonstrations in the first few months. And then all of the organizations, like the large organizations at least, suddenly the focus on Palestine was completely shifted just in the last month or two. So maybe this is a testament to how much electoralism has infiltrated itself in so-called movement spaces. Maybe this is just a testament to how there was like basically a lack of escalation. Or really a strategy, but I don't know, just like why with all this potential capacity and all this noise that was taking place in the first 2 months, why have things really kind of fallen flat in terms of the international solidarity movement?
Two
What?
reasons. One is obviously there is no real revolutionary organizations and or real revolutionary propaganda machines in the West.
Mm-hmm.
The organizations that were leading these demonstrations were all liberal organizations, and the media that is supporting the Palestinian struggle in the West, all these independent media is capitalist itself. It's all about careers and money and
Mm-hmm.
making platforms. There's no real revolutionary media between all of those.
Yeah.
And so you can't have change without a party and a propaganda arm, mass propaganda arm. So that's one. The other thing is that nobody likes to bet on a losing horse.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason, beyond the images of genocide coming out from Palestine that moved the world, the only reason we had this mass movement of support was because the Palestinian people resistance and the Lebanese resistance were showing victories, and were
Yeah.
winning the war and showing heroics and achievements. Okay, so now that's gone. Now the leadership of the Axis of Resistance, for the most part, are all been assassinated, and a huge destruction of Syria and Lebanon, military capabilities of Hezbollah and in the Palestinian territories. And suddenly, those who were rallying behind the winning horse just flipped to and or went quiet. Okay, and now you see actually more and more of those who were all together supporting the Palestinians starting to also cannibalize each other, attacking each other, selling out Syria, blaming Syria, attacking the Axis. So this is all symptoms of humanity. This is the human condition.
Yeah.
You cannot expect the people to be behind you if you're showing them that you're a loser.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we can blame the people, but that's the human condition. And so the factors that we need to win revolutionary change is, one, to be militarily capable and on the offensive, never on the defensive. Second, to have
As far as
mass media
yeah.
propaganda machine that actually not only informs, but radicalizes and calls into action. And then a leadership that can lead this action on the ground in the West.
Yeah. Absolutely. But I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah, even as Hezbollah's leadership was assassinated, was martyred, they still fought pretty well. We still saw the videos coming out. Actually, the strongest attack, in my opinion, on the Zionist entity came just days before, which actually was the reason, their arm was twisted enough to make them call for the ceasefire, was Sunday before the ceasefire when Tel Aviv was hit by Hezbollah. And that was the first time I really felt like there was like not the first time at all, but the biggest impact and the biggest um, really shaking of the Zionist entity that came from Lebanon on all levels. So I mean the resistance continued to fight. So what really about the resistance in Gaza and the resistance in Lebanon really projects that there's any kind of losing or weakness in any way, other than what people want to take out of the killings of leadership, which we know for the resistance, it doesn't really it doesn't kill the movement.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they are lost.
Mm-hmm.
Hezbollah can definitely rebuild, and it is rebuilding, it is recovering. But we can't lie to ourselves and say that there is no effect for the assassination of these huge figures.
Of
I mean,
course.
Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is nations like the Arabic people birth one person like that every 100 years, between
Yeah,
Abdel Nasser and and Sayyid Nasrallah. There is nobody else that you can. And this is not only about us as Arabs, it's every other nation cannot birth somebody of this stature, many of them all at once. They can birth one like that every 100 years. So the loss of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is huge. And many Lebanese people within Hezbollah followers tell you that they feel orphaned right now.
that's what
Okay,
they yeah.
and that's not them exaggerating. That's a feeling, and
Yeah.
clearly people all around the world, even those who were not Shia and or Lebanese, felt that loss. So same thing with Sinwar in Gaza. You need now a birth of a new leadership. Now what's left in Hamas, at least, those figures that are left are not as inspirational as somebody like Sinwar, and the movement has to birth somebody like that for it to. Now,
Yeah.
saying all of this, it just, the closer you are to the struggle, the more sure you are of that you can continue. Because,
Mm-hmm.
but talking about somebody in Canada or in Australia that was supporting the Palestinians and the Lebanese resistance, I don't know how fortified they are in their position as they see these huge genocides being conducted.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because there was a lot of morale, that came from the global, movement. Not only the outrage at the genocide, but also the emboldenment from the resistance at its peak. So I think it's more in terms of the perception rather than the reality, which we haven't really begun to grasp yet of the resistance's strength and capability is definitely a factor in why you've seen this energy go. And there has been a projection of that against the Arabs. You feel like there's a blame on Palestinians now for what happened in Palestine and in Syria. There's a blame on the Arabs. We've been blaming the Comprador Arabs forever, so that's not who we're talking about. No expectations there, but you just see a lot of like these pundits who have spent the last year just kind of talking about this issue. Now just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, they just need to fight back. And that's what we've been doing essentially. But yeah, there's just a lot of defeatism being spread and a lot of blame pointed where it shouldn't.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
the Arabic people are the most maligned people on the planet.
Mhm.
And I'm purposely saying Arabs, I'm not, bringing Iran into this, because the amount of racism there is in Western societies against Arabic people is very specific.
Yeah.
And, you know, to hear all these pundits like Scott Ritter and others blaming the Arabs and saying the Arabs are unredeemable or can't, I mean, what is there redeemable about Western cultures? There is nothing revolutionary that came out of the West in more than 100 years. There's not been there hasn't been one American that died for a good cause carrying arms in 100 years. Okay. Other than, of course,
the Black Panthers
and the American Indian movement. So what is there to redeem in Western culture? The other thing is that if you notice, everybody in these leftist progressive circles, whatever it is in the West, they're like all for African unity. They're all for Latin unity. But Arabs, if you say Arabic unity, you're an Arab colonizer. What are you talking about? What Arabs? There's no such thing as Arabs. So we are not allowed.
And of course, this is why the neo-Ottoman propaganda or the neo-Ottoman, political vision that the U.S. pumped up during the Obama administration in our region, almost like I feel like it got transferred over and reprojected into Muslim spaces, Muslim organizing spaces and institutions in the U.S. Was to really create a complete division over Syria. So you can't even think about having that because you have Arabs and Muslims so divided over the Syria issue and failing to see it basically is just a very basic issue of imperialism.
Yeah, look, you shouldn't believe it. We shouldn't look at social media as an indicator of what truly people believe.
This is even outside of social media.
Yeah.
Like even just in physical spaces, you almost can't have these conversations with a group of Arabs without people like yelling at you for being an Assadist, just for.
Yeah. I mean, that's look. What I was trying to say here is that those same people that are not Arab, not Muslim, outsiders. I'm not talking about inside. That are like, Arabs are failure. They can't defend themselves. They don't say this about sub-Saharan Africans. They don't say that about Latin Americans. They don't say that about other Asians. It's just Arabs.
Yeah.
Arabs are the only ones to blame for the colonization and imperialism of their territories, right?
Yeah.
Arabs are the only ones to blame for their unsuccess in not being able to succeed in the decolonization process. Although we were the first
that haven't been completely wiped out by settler colonialism.
Yes,
they couldn't even start with the Zionist entity.
The first to also succeed in decolonization. It was Syria, for instance, the first country on the whole planet that kicked out the colonizers after World War II. 1942, the first country to become independent of colonial rule after the end of World War II, before China became independent. It is, Jamal Abdel Nasser that lifted all of Africa almost out of colonialism and poverty. Okay, so there's this inhumane look at Arabs that sets us in a separate category in time and space out of all of other nations on this planet. We are not allowed unification. We're also not allowed to mention our glorious days. Like every time I post something about Syria or Arabic resistance or the natural geography, borders, or whatever it is, cultural borders, I get jumped on the internet. Arab nationalist. You Arabs are colonizers. Even just mentioning the name of some glorious warrior from 100 years ago garners these reactions. But you can mention the names of glorious leaders